So, you think photography is easy? Not really. If you want to be creative with your shots, but it'd be a lot easier if you know all about the exposure triangle. So we're starting with the basics, and I'm going to explain something that is a complete mystery to many amateur photographers. Yet it's vital if you want to take your photography to the next level. Amazingly, it's not difficult, provided you have a clear understanding of the three elements involved: aperture, shutter speed and ISO, commonly known as the exposure triangle. Hi, I'm Ken Hadfield. Welcome to the Better Photography channel. This session is intended to encourage my amateur photographer friends to move away from the automatic mode on your cameras, to try out unfamiliar settings that I guarantee will change your photography forever. Learning these settings will super enhance your creativity, using functions designed and built into your camera by the manufacturers to allow you to produce stunning images impossible to recreate in automatic mode. By using these settings, you'll release massive opportunities to be creative. That's worlds apart from point and click photography. In order to create a good, well-exposed image, you need to understand what happens inside the camera when you take a photograph. After you choose your camera settings, you point, focus, then click the shutter. And in an instant, light enters through the lens, hits the shutter curtain, which opens up, exposing the sensor for the amount of time set as your shutter speed. And then it quickly closes again, allowing no more light to enter the camera body. Your shot is now taken. So let's look at what you can do to influence the outcome of the shot before you press the shutter. Let's start with an introduction to the three elements in this triangle. The first part of the exposure triangle is shutter speed. This is the length of time the shutter opens to expose light to the sensor. Now, shutter speed is measured in seconds and fractions of a second. Now, some cameras allow shutter speeds as low as 30 seconds and others may vary, so check out your manual. Once you go below a 1 second shutter speed, the exposure times drop to fractions of a second, going up to an amazing 1/8000th of a second on some high-end cameras. Here's an easy way to remember how shutter speed affects your image. Fast shutter speeds freezes fast motion, and slow shutter speeds allow you to shoot in lower light, which could be useful for night shooting or deliberate blurring of your image. However, you must consider using a tripod for any shot of 1 second or longer, even if your camera has image stabilization, to avoid blurring because of handshake. The second part of the exposure triangle is aperture. Simply explained, this is basically an adjustable opening within a lens that guides light into your camera body. The aperture also controls depth of field, which is basically the part of your image you'd like to remain sharp and focused. If the aperture opening is small, then the depth of field will be large and the entire image will be sharp and well defined. If the aperture opening is large, then the depth of field will be small and only the intended part of your image will be in focus. Aperture settings are measured by stops, usually starting at f1.4 right up to as high as f32, depending on your camera and lens. Hence, when you hear photographers advising you to go up or down a couple of stops, it just means adjust the aperture settings either up or down by 2 levels. So for example, if you were shooting at an aperture of say f8, you would go down 2 stops to f6.3, or you would go up 2 stops to f10. Now you can use this control to raise or lower your exposure by either halves or thirds of a stop, depending how your camera is set up. This gives you excellent control over your exposure, giving you tiny exposure adjustments to make your shot perfect. Confusingly, the f-stop with the largest opening is shown as the smallest number on your camera. So f1.2 will have a very large opening and f32 will have a very small opening. There is, however, an easier way to remember aperture settings. You use a lower number for shallow depth of field and a larger number for full back to front sharpness. Incidentally, for general photography, f8 is considered the sweet spot in terms of optimum focus. When shooting in family scenes and events or images that need a large depth of field. Stick to f8 and you should be okay. The third part of the exposure triangle is ISO or ISO. The simplest explanation of this function is that ISO lightens and darkens your image, and that's about it. ISO settings are measured from ISO 100, 200, 400, right up to 112,000 on some cameras. ISO electronically affects the sensor, allowing you to capture more light. That makes it possible for you to raise the shutter speed to take images in lower light or to avoid motion blurring. But there is a trade-off for using ISO, because using a high setting will introduce noise or graininess in your images. But provided your ISO settings are not set too high, you can usually fix this in post-production. I would once again remind you that in most situations where you use long exposure, you should either use a tripod or find a flat, secure place to keep the camera as still as possible. Personally, I prefer to have my images slightly underexposed rather than overexposed, as it's usually possible to recover the underexposed details in post, but it's simply not possible to recover overexposed images where the whites are completely burnt out, because there's no detail to recover. So if you use an aperture setting with a small opening, not much light will hit the sensor, so the camera will need the shutter to open for longer to collect more light. In low light conditions, you're not likely to be able to capture fast moving subjects, because the camera would demand a shutter speed too slow to capture motion without unacceptable blurring. And that's when ISO comes into play. By raising the ISO to make the sensor more sensitive, you can then safely raise your shutter speed to make sure your image is sharp with no motion blur. In fact, if I was starting out again as an amateur today, I'd look up my ISO settings on my camera and set them to auto ISO. That way the ISO will automatically kick in if I try to take an image that will be underexposed. I also want to take a moment to talk about a great feature that is invaluable, especially for beginners needing a way to quickly raise or lower their exposure without changing their existing camera settings. Exposure compensation. This valuable tool can be used whilst using Aperture Priority, Shutter Priority, or the P program modes on your camera, but it's usually disabled when shooting in manual. This allows you to brighten or darken your exposure by overriding your existing camera settings, allowing you to make the change quickly and effectively, increasing or decreasing your exposure. Now, most modern cameras have an exposure compensation feature, which should show as a scale on the rear screen of your camera, showing from -3 stops to +3 stops. And it's likely that the indicator will be at a default setting in the central 0 position. The control for this setting is usually found in the camera menu or by rotating a dial on the camera. I strongly recommend you find out how to access and use this feature and then practice how it affects your shots. It can be a lifesaver. Now let's put in practice what we've just learned, as I demonstrate these settings and the effect they can have on your images once you've discovered and mastered the benefits of the exposure triangle. Let's look at Aperture Priority. Simply explained, this feature gives you choice to blur the background in your image. We've all seen the magazine shots showing a model standing in the foreground with a lovely soft milky background, almost giving it a 3D effect, drawing attention to the model in a beautiful portrait. It's an industry standard, and it's easier than you think, and there is no reason why you cannot use your camera to reproduce this look with your portraits. First, you need to set your aperture to the lowest possible setting. Mine is 2.8, but yours may be higher depending upon your lens. Use a zoom lens if you have one, and zoom out to the maximum distance, and take the shot. Well, that's a lovely shot, subject and nicely focused with a beautiful soft dreamy background. Simple but effective use of this low aperture setting. Now I use this technique on my wedding photography for most of my romantic shots, and the clients love it. Imagine being able to apply this setting to your portrait shots. It's easy once you know the settings. Shooting at f.8 aperture is generally considered the sweet spot for sharpness. The aperture is half open and half closed, and that gives the photographer a great deal of focal sharpness. This standard setting is one of the most often used by all photographers, professional and amateur. If you look at f16, now this is the aperture usually used for most landscape images, where it's necessary to have the image nicely sharp from front to the back of the image. This image gives a large depth of field, showing the entire image fully sharp. Now, let's look at shutter priority. Shutter priority settings allow you to create fantastic effects well beyond simple, well-focused images. So let's explore some of the settings you can use to either make time stand still or to slow time down, giving unusual, unique aspects of everyday life. I've travelled to the market town of Barnet Castle and I'm standing on a riverbank with the River Tees flowing behind. And there are some wonderful rapids just behind me, perfect to practice my shutter settings. I've moved my camera settings to shutter priority to capture two very different images of the water flowing over the rocks. My first setting is a fast shutter speed of 500th of a second, which will effectively stop the water flow in its tracks. The second setting is 1/8 of a second, which will add a lovely creamy soft effect on the water. Remember, you'll need a tripod to take any shot with such a long exposure. Now let's examine these images side by side. The fast shutter speed has frozen the water in its tracks, and the slow shutter speed has created a soft, pleasing, milky water effect. Now let's see how shutter priority can be used to show interesting effects on subjects that are fast moving. I'm standing roadside waiting for vehicles travelling at speed to capture several images at different shutter speeds to see how the settings affect the outcome of the images. I'll be using settings of 1/500th of a second, 1/6 of a second and a shot at 1 full second. Now let's take a moment to review each shot. The shot taken at 1/500th of a second has frozen the motion of the car and it pretty much looks like it's standing still. The image shot at 1/6 of a second clearly shows that the car is in motion and there's an interesting blur depicting the car's movement. Now, the 1 second exposure shows very little detail with massive blurring and the car is barely recognisable. So these have been simple examples of aperture and shutter priority in action. These settings are the mainstay of creative photography, and using one or all of them will expand your photographic creativity to levels you could never imagine. Now it's up to you. Go! Try out the settings to expand your creativity. Find your genre and style of photography, then get the very best from your camera, using aperture and shutter priority settings. Now hopefully, by watching this session, you'll have learned some valuable tips on how to improve your photography. But now, I want you to follow up by taking your camera out and practicing these settings until you're second nature. I guarantee you it will open up a new, rewarding opportunity to showcase your new skills. Staying on automatic settings uses only a fraction of your camera's capabilities, and it severely restricts your creativity. You're in a great situation because you already have the camera and hopefully the time and the opportunity to practice. It costs nothing and has no consequence for you to practice. If the shot's not right, then simply change the settings until you're happy the camera has taken exactly the shot you had in mind. There's no costly film processing, no waiting. You have limitless space on your memory card to experiment. Practice until you get it right, and eventually, just like riding a bike, you'll never forget how to make the changes needed to capture that special photograph in the look and style that you want, instead of having the camera's automatic settings forcing you to accept mediocre photography. Make sure you take the time to go look closely at other photographers' work. I learned a huge amount of knowledge after finding a website that showcases all types of photography. And this site is great because not only do you see exceptional examples of amateur and professional photography, but the camera EXIF data is also displayed. That means you can see the camera settings used by the photographer to capture the image. I looked at many thousands of images and studied the camera settings, which gave me vital information on how I should set up my settings to capture similar quality images. And it worked. The more I studied other photographers' work, the more my photography skills improved. So much so that I started posting there myself. And that's where my photography was first discovered, by a picture agency who contacted me directly from the site, offering a contract to sell my photos to publishers. So go visit www.500px.com, grab a coffee or 3 and explore. I'll put a direct link down below so you can check it out. Now this episode is just to explain the relationship of the 3 elements in the triangle, so make sure you hit that subscribe button and watch out for future episodes, because soon I'm going to upload individual episodes explaining shutter speed, aperture and ISO in much greater detail. Finally, Don't despair when you see gallery after gallery of professional looking images anywhere on the net. You need to remember everyone posting online is showcasing their very best images. And don't fall into the trap of assuming pro photographers only take award-winning shots as a daily occurrence. I wish. Like all others, I only post shots that I think are worthy of sharing. As an example, when I travel to Africa in the 4 weeks I usually have available, my daily target for what I would call a great shot is perhaps 4 or 5 images. And it's not that unusual for me to be disappointed. But I do get lots and lots of good shots, which I share on my website and social media. But you have to accept failure is a huge part of your wildlife photography journey. You just have to shrug your shoulders and move on to the next location. So when you look at stunning shots online, there are probably many not so great shots lying unused or unusable on the photographer's hard drive. This shot of a pelican diving in Florida took me 2 hours and over 500 shots until the frame showed exactly what I wanted, the pelican's bill just entering the water. Sometimes you just have to suffer for your art. So get out there and put in practice what you've learned today and get ready to surprise yourself and everyone around you as you use the Exposure Triangle to create incredible images. See you next time on the Better Photography channel.